No one remembered him, but somewhere stories were still told of the man who once stood alone against evil. There was a man who lived at the edge of the desert. He waited for no one, believed in nothing, held on to nothing except a promise made to the past. Then one morning the wind brought a small body lying in the dust, and from that moment on, death was no longer the only thing that stayed. Beneath a sky streaked red like rusted iron, a late summer wind swept across the scorched edge of New Mexico, dragging with it thin dust and the stale scent of old sweat. There, in the vast silence, stood a weathered pinewood cabin, tilted slightly, like the shoulders of a man long tired, untouched by repair for years. Its wooden door hung ajar, hinges loose, creaking each time the wind slipped through. On the porch, a chair rocked in silence, rough-carved, rotted by time, caked in desert dust, groaning now and then like the sigh of old timber gone too long without a hand. Beside it, on a small table, sat an old oil lamp, and behind it, a tilted, faded photograph of a woman with black hair and soft eyes, cradling a bundle of dried lavender. Jonas Thorne sat there, a man whose shape time had not yet taken, but whose eyes no longer held the light they once did. He was past 50, tall, built solid as the Colorado River stones, but something in the way his fingers laced together, thin, dry, showed he no longer hoped they'd be held again. Around the cabin there were no voices, no livestock, no fresh wagon tracks. Only a broken fence, a few feral hens no one counted, and a leaning post to the east, ready to fall like it had been waiting for permission. Jonas rose early each morning, not to begin anything new, but out of an old habit that refused to die. He lit the stove with dry kindling, brewed thick black coffee, and waited for it to boil, the battered metal pot ticking over like brittle bones. No radio, no paper, no letters. He received nothing and sent nothing in return. Each morning he swept the dust off the porch, not because anyone might come, but because his wife used to sit there reading in the sun. Though she had been gone 12 years, he kept the porch clean. It wasn't grief. It was a kind of commitment, quiet, stubborn, the way a Western man loved, not in words, but in the doing. Come evening, Jonas rode his horse to the edge of the ridge, where the land cracked into canyons. He stared south, where earth touched sky, as if waiting for something he himself no longer knew how to name. His hand rested on the saddle horn, his back slightly bowed. The wind pulled his coat aside, revealing the old revolver still strapped to his hip, a part of his body now not separate. He planted nothing new. He rebuilt nothing. He marked no trail on any map. He simply lived, or more truthfully, he had not yet died. And perhaps, in a place like this, in this brittle pine cabin of New Mexico, that too was a kind of survival. In a place the world had forgotten, Jonas Thorne remembered still, not people, not time, but duty to a piece of land, to a wife, to a part of himself he had not spoken aloud in years. That day was no different, except a hawk flew lower than usual, and on the horizon, where the sand began to change color, a strange brown shape had appeared, breathing with the wind. Western dust never holds anything for long. Footprints, dried blood, or the vows of forgotten years. The wind wipes them all clean. But that morning, when Jonas Thorne rode his silver-gray stallion south of the cabin, down to the old well near the sunburned yucca grove, he saw something the wind hadn't yet hidden. At first, he thought it was an animal left behind, a wolf carcass, maybe, or a coyote dried out by hunger, a gray-brown shape in the pale yellow dust, nearly the same color as the earth. But his horse stopped, stiffened, and that alone made Jonas take a second look. He dismounted, head low, eyes narrowed through the shimmer of early light dancing on the gravel. It wasn't an animal. There was no doubt now. It was a person, a girl, lying on her side at the edge of the dry well, her left hand bound with coarse rope, fresh fibers cut into her skin, blood trickling down the back of her torn cotton blouse. Mud clung to her ankles, hair matted with grit and sand. Her face tilted to the sky, sun-darkened, nose sharp, cheeks streaked with dirt, but her half-lidded eyes still held a glimmer, not quite pleading, more like she no longer had the strength to call out, only the quiet hope someone might see her. Jonas didn't rush. He didn't run, didn't shout. He just walked, slow and steady, as if every step was a quiet reckoning between the earth and a part of his conscience that refused to stay buried. A soft breeze moved through. Dust swirled around his boots, then settled near the small body like it meant to shield her. Jonas knelt, knees crunching softly in the sand. His right hand reached out, slow, resting lightly on her wrist, where a weak pulse still fluttered. Then he looked up, scanning the horizon. No horse tracks, no nearby camps, which meant she'd come on foot, or had been left behind. He drew the dagger from his belt, the blade nicked, the black leather handle slick from years of sweat, and cut the rope binding her wrist. The strands fell away. Her hand twitched once, then dropped limp. Like a young branch snapped in a storm, she said nothing. Near the place where the rope had dug in was a long red welt, blood dried in layers like the bark of a scorched tree. Maybe a whip, maybe a knife. Didn't matter what. Jonas understood one thing. No one should be left to die in this land that way. He laid his hand on her forehead, hot and damp, then slipped the other beneath her neck. And for the first time in many years, he used his strength to lift a person, not a sack of grain, not a saddle, a human being. Her body was lighter than he expected, light as if life itself had already slipped halfway out. He carried her toward the horse. The sand pressed deep beneath his boots, marking clear tracks, until the wind passed through again and began to erase them. The horse snorted softly. Jonas tied her carefully across the saddle, her back against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder like a child fallen asleep in the middle of war. No words were spoken. Only the soft creak of leather reins, the groan of saddle straps, and the wind slipping through the collar of a man who had once sworn he'd save no one ever again. But that day, a brown speck in the sand turned his horse around, and Jonas Thorne, the last man still bound to a promise he made only to himself, carried life back to a rotting pine cabin, where death usually waited just beyond the crooked door. The horse stopped at the edge of the broken fence. Jonas dismounted, his body lowering slowly like an old tree, settling into dry season earth. His eyes swept once around the cabin, guided by the deep instinct of men who had survived too many moonless nights. Still the same place, the slanted roof, the door that slammed in the wind, the old chair waiting for his back to return. But this time, he did not return alone. The girl in his arms remained unconscious. Her skin had gone pale, her breaths so faint they seemed held in place by the thread of a feather inside her chest. Jonas stepped over the wooden threshold, nudged the creaking door open with his boot, and in his arms was something he hadn't carried since the day his wife was buried beneath the southern hill. He didn't lay her in his own bed. Instead, he pulled out an old wool blanket he once kept for guests. No one had touched it in 10 years, shook off the layer of dust that clung like soil on a gravestone. Carefully, he laid her down the way one sets down something rare and easily broken, not in haste, not too close, not staring too long. Then he lit the fire. The flames danced, but the warmth was slow to come. In the cold stone cabin, he placed a cast-iron pot on the stove, dropped in some dry mint leaves and a pinch of coarse salt. Not medicine, but enough to wipe away old blood and the deadly chill left by desert nights. Still the girl did not wake. Her eyes remained closed, Her lashes cast soft shadows on her cheeks. Each breath made a sound like wind slipping through an open wooden door. Faint, far apart, but not yet gone. Jonas sat down in the chair, unbuckled the gun belt from his waist, and laid it across his thigh, close but not within easy reach. Then he picked up a cloth, dipped it in warm water, and knelt beside the bed. One by one, he wiped the blood from her back, washed the caked dust from her bound wrist, and pulled tiny thorns from the soles of her feet. Wounds left by someone who would never look back. No words were spoken, no groaning, no pleading, no questions, only the silence of two souls blown by the same wind beneath a shared roof. And no one could say why it had to be that day. When he finished, he covered her with a thick wool blanket, rough fibers once belonging to his wife during their early years on the ranch. He folded the edge beneath her chin, not touching skin. Just enough. Enough to hold the heat in, enough to let her know she wasn't lying alone on desert earth. He returned to his chair, leaned back against the wall, and pulled an old handkerchief from his coat pocket, wiping his hands not because they were dirty, but because something in the blood refused to be washed away by water. Outside, the sky had turned heavy. A dust cloud was crawling down the mountainside, and the wind pushed harder through the doorframe's cracks. Jonas closed his eyes. He did not pray. He just sat there, his back cold against stone, his hands heavy with fatigue, and his gun lying still. As if tonight this man had nothing left to protect, except one fragile life, shivering under a worn blanket that still carried the scent of the woman he once loved and lost many years before. The moon had long since set. Night blanketed the cabin like a layer of ash, falling evenly across the roof. Silent and heavy. Wind howled through the cracks in the window panes, crying in bursts like voices calling from the other side. The coal stove still glowed red, but its warmth reached only to the edge of the bed. The rest of the room held the brittle cold of the frontier. A chill that needed no snow, only earth and stone left untouched for far too long. Jonas remained where he'd sat since dusk. He didn't sleep, didn't shift his weight. His back rested against the wall, legs stretched out, the gun lying across his thighs. His hands were clasped together, thumbs slowly circling one another as if fingering a rosary. But there were no beads, no God to call on tonight. The girl breathed unevenly. Her chest rose and fell in slow, ragged rhythm. Now and then her breath would hitch, as if even pain in her dreams was enough to exhaust her further. Once she uttered a sound, soft, half a name, half a word in some native tongue, cut short like something strangled inside her throat. Jonas opened his eyes. He didn't move toward her, just sat there, head tilted slightly, his silhouette like a stone sentinel guarding the threshold, silent but not absent. The wind swept hard against the roof. A few planks creaked in reply. On the stove, the water had boiled down to nearly nothing. The last steam rose thin, like a ghost brushing past the shoulder of a man who once believed in good things. In that pressing stillness, memory crept in, not all at once, not in floods, but like smoke from damp firewood, slow, dim, unable to disappear into night. He saw his wife, not as she was in health, but as she lay dying on that very bed, beneath the same wool blanket now covering another woman. Her hand was cold then, but still tried to hold his. No sobs, no final words, just a soft nod, maybe an apology, maybe thanks. And after she was gone, he stayed. Not to hold on to anything, but so he wouldn't step over her last footprints on the way out. A soft groan pulled him back to the present. The girl stirred. One arm slipped from beneath the blanket, trembled, then pulled back in. Her lips moved in sleep, murmuring that same word from before, but clearer this time, a name, broken, carried off by the night wind. Jonas exhaled deeply. He pulled his handkerchief from his pocket, wiped his brow, then gently laid an extra blanket over her shoulders. Didn't touch her skin. Didn't wake her. He wasn't used to tending the weak. But as he placed the blanket over her, his hand paused longer than it needed to, as if he'd touched something he'd lost long ago. He returned to his chair, his hand brushing the gun, not out of fear, but because he knew, in this world, evil doesn't sleep, and tonight, someone was dreaming of fire. But he was a man long used to sitting beside the ash. Morning did not arrive with birdsong or sunlight, but with warm breath rising from the old stove, drifting softly past windows veiled in ash. The fire had been lit again before dawn. From kindling, Jonas gathered on the hill behind the cabin. It burned steady, without hurry. White smoke curled gently along the wooden walls before slipping out through the roof, like someone leaving quietly, not wanting anyone to know they'd ever stopped by. Jonas stood with his back to the bed. In his hand was an old iron pot, cornmeal porridge with a few black beans and a pinch of salt. Not much, but enough to feed someone who hadn't yet decided whether to live or die. He placed a wooden bowl and spoon beside the bed, didn't speak, didn't touch, then stepped back a few paces and returned to his chair. His eyes flicked toward her, not to see if she had woken, but as if he were standing guard over something more fragile than life itself. Morning light crept onto the edge of the bed. The old blanket stirred, and slowly the girl's eyes opened. At first they were hazy, then the ache pulled her back from whatever ledge she'd been lying near. She turned her head, didn't sit up, just scanned the cracked wooden ceiling. The smell of porridge, ash, and old cloth filled her lungs, instead of the stench of blood and horse dung from the days before. Jonas looked at her, not with comfort, but with a quiet nod, as if between them there was an unspoken agreement. You're alive, I know. She lifted her hand, stiffly, like it wasn't yet used to being free. Then slowly she picked up the spoon, scooped a bit of porridge, brought it to her mouth and chewed, slowly, very slowly, as if each bite was a test. Is this real, or just another mirage? Jonas didn't stare. He turned toward the door. Light fell across his cheek, etching every deep line like the bark of an oak that had survived too many droughts. She took a few more spoonfuls, not much. Then the spoon slipped from her fingers, and her head eased back onto the pillow. Her eyes remained open, but no longer trembled. No thank you, no wary glance, just a thin stillness, just enough for both to believe that in a desert full of dust, a roof might still remember how to hold human warmth. Jonas stood, carried the pot back to the stove. When he returned, he picked up the spoon, placed it carefully in the bowl. She watched him, didn't speak. But her gaze was no longer that of a hunted animal. It held something else. Not yet trust, not quite gratitude, but the look of a creature that had just climbed from cold water onto a bank and realized it had not been left behind. Outside, the light was clearer now. Jonas's shadow stretched long across the wooden floor, cutting through the girl's legs that shifted faintly beneath the blanket. A new day had begun. Without gunfire, without sandstorms, just a pot of porridge, a glance, and a man quietly wiping a spoon clean, as if it were a solemn ritual for those who had once lost faith and found it again, in silence. Midday. Sunlight slanted through the cracks in the roof, sharp as blades slicing across the faded wood floor. The cabin felt like a cell without a lock, filled only with time, light, and the occasional creak of timber contracting under heat. Jonas sat at the table holding a roll of old bandage. On the tabletop, a half-finished bottle of whiskey from years ago, a bowl of boiled water left to cool, and a small knife, fire-sterilized, clean, but still scarred by time and use. The girl was sitting upright in bed, propped against extra pillows stuffed behind her back. Her face was pale, forehead slick with sweat, but her eyes were no longer those of the drowned. They held awareness, and the natural wariness of a creature that had once been hunted. Jonas walked over, unhurried. He placed the roll of bandage beside the bed, then sat on a low stool, just a few handspans from her. He raised a hand, then paused mid-air, not touching her, just letting her see his gesture and understand. "I need to see the wound." She gave a slight nod. No words. Jonas reached behind her, searching for the blood-stuck edge of her torn shirt. Slow, very slow. When he peeled back the soaked fabric, underneath was a small back, pale from blood loss and fever, but it held more than a knife wound. Beneath the shirt, her back was a map of pain. Cross-hatched whip marks, deep scars that had healed twisted, burns shaped like handprints, and a strange tattoo, square, angular, carved with coal ink or blade. Not decorative, it was a mark of a gang, a rite, a punishment no law would ever record. Jonas froze. His eyes dropped, then closed, as if to lock away what he'd just seen. He drew a breath, soaked a clean cloth with whiskey, and began to clean the wound. Each time his hand touched her skin, not rough, she flinched slightly, but never whimpered, never resisted. She only recoiled faintly, like a reflex carved into survival. Jonas said nothing. His hands didn't tremble, but at times they slowed, as if each stroke forced him to face old images in his mind. The years he wore a uniform, the child corpses he'd seen along the Chihuahua border, the day he shot a man for trying to sell his wife to white traffickers. When the bandage was finally wrapped clean around her back, he rose, retrieved one of his wife's old shirts from a wooden peg, and placed it on the edge of the bed. She looked at it, touched the collar, then whispered, very softly, a voice laced with English and her native tongue, "Nia. Not safe. Man take." Jonas paused at the stove. He didn't turn around, but those few words cut through the cabin's silence like an arrow. Nothing more needed to be said. Her name was Nia. She wasn't safe. Someone had taken her, not out of hatred, but for use. Jonas opened the window, letting in more light. In that light, his figure stood tall and still, like a stone tower rising from dry earth. It wasn't that he'd never saved anyone before. It was just he'd forgotten what it felt like when someone first called your name, not with their mouth, but with their trust. The wind blew down from the mountains. It carried the scent of old wood smoke, crushed dry grass, and the faint, distant sound of hooves striking red earth somewhere far off. Not wagon wheels, not engines, but the kind of sound once as familiar to Jonas as his own heartbeat in youth. And now it returned, like a warning from something long dead, knocking at the door. Nia lay asleep in the bed, sweat soaking through the blanket, her forehead less tense, her breathing steady. But Jonas did not sleep. He sat on the porch, gun on his lap, eyes fixed on the ridgeline ahead, where the last light of day was slipping away like a tired sentry abandoning post. His horse grew restless in the pen, snorting and pacing. The chickens in their coop clucked quietly. Somewhere near the tree line, a stray dog, origin unknown, let out one short howl, then fell silent. Jonas stood slowly, like an old tree bracing itself after a long winter. He didn't need to look, he could feel it. The northern rise, where the wind always changed and the sun never fully rose. Someone was there. He took a pair of binoculars from the wooden shelf, wiped off the dust, and stepped up onto the porch. From there, a clear view of the open plain. And he saw them. 10 figures, tall horses, low saddles, scarves tied at the brow, leather cloaks across the shoulders. Apache, no masks, no weapons lowered, but they did not approach. They stood like tree shadows on the high bank, silent, waiting, no flag, no words. One of them, the eldest, by the look of him, raised a hand slowly, gave a single wave, then dismounted and began walking towards the cabin. Alone, Jonas did not move forward. He let the man close the distance, red dust clinging to his boots, silence wrapping the walk in twilight. Near the gate, the man stopped, gave a slight nod, then spoke in English, thick but clear. "The girl, she no longer belongs to us, but someone is looking for her, and he is not like us." Jonas gave no reply, just nodded back, softly like a man who understood that truth often comes from those who've lived longer in lies than oneself. The man gave his name, Tauzin. He spoke, not with the tone of a man pleading, but as if passing on an old truth. The girl, Nia, was once part of their people, but she had been taken by a man with no tribe, no code, only guns, gold, and a hunger that turned human lives into cargo. Jonas listened. He asked no questions, but his eyes narrowed just slightly when Tauzin spoke a name, Crover Black. That name was like a scar across the memory of anyone who'd lived near this border, not because he started wars, but because he always survived them, like a parasite feeding on the suffering of others. Tauzin did not stay long. He placed a small pouch on the ground. Inside, healing herbs, wound powder, and a piece of cloth hand-stitched with the markings of Nia's tribe. He said, "We don't help her anymore, but if you keep her, know this, something is coming, and it does not believe in words." Jonas bent down, picked up the pouch. When he looked back up, Tauzin had already turned, mounted his horse, and the Apache riders faded into the horizon like a dream made of fire, leaving behind ash and wind, but no scent of men. The sun fell fast behind the ridge. The cabin's shadow stretched far, all the way to the very line where Nia had first been found. Jonas turned back, the medicine pouch in his hand, heavier than he expected. No one had knocked, truly, but tonight the door might open in another way. Night fell fast in New Mexico, not like back east where twilight stretches and street lamps trick the mind. Here the sky drops like a sprung trap, giving no one time to prepare. Jonas sat by the fire, a small piece of leather in his hand, left behind by Tauzin. Its edge was ragged, torn as if it had been ripped away in flight. Beside him lay the medicine pouch. He hadn't used it yet, just touched each item gently as if reading a letter written with trembling hands. Nia had fallen asleep again, a heavy, deep sleep after a day spent burning through her strength. But this time there were no fever dreams, no whispered names, only steady breath, quiet and even, like a river finding its way back to the bed it once carved. The wind struck the door, not hard, not threatening, but as if someone stood outside, needing no entry. And still, it made the inside colder than usual. Jonas rose and stepped onto the porch. The sky was pitch black, starless, but far off, along the southern horizon, a faint glow moved. Not moonlight, not lanterns, but fire, traveling like a caravan. He knew that light. Years ago, when he worked for the Border Patrol, he had helped burn the camps of slavers. They used cage wagons to haul women across the desert, selling them into El Paso. When chased, they burned the wagons and everyone inside, to leave no evidence. That glow, like the shine of dead eyes catching fire, was something you never mistook. Jonas went back inside, pulled an old chest from beneath the bed. He opened it. Inside lay a Winchester 1873, oiled and clean, and a few bullets still wrapped in paper. Beneath it all, a rusted badge from his old unit, the words Justice Frontier Corps barely legible. He stared at it for a moment, then folded it shut, put it away. He wasn't a lawman anymore, but tonight he might still have to do what's right. Sitting back down, he thought of the name, Crover Black. The first time he'd heard it was from a woman who fled Arizona, her face beaten beyond recognition. She had said, "He doesn't kill them, he sells them, like livestock, but ones that walk and birth money." The second time came from a boy, a Mexican child who escaped from a cage wagon, thin as a reed, his eyes no longer black, but the color of dried blood. Crover had no tribe, no hometown. He appeared like an owl in a forest, never seen, only known by the people who vanished afterward. Men like him never stayed long, but they always left something behind. A carved mark on a door, a symbol in blood, a piece of hair braided into rope. Jonas stood, blew out the oil lamp. He stepped to the bed, pulled the blanket higher over Nia's shoulders. She didn't wake, but her lips moved faintly. Jonas bowed his head, as if he heard the thing she hadn't yet said. Then he turned, stepped outside, and closed the door quietly, like folding away a memory. Out there, Crover's fire was drawing near, and there are men who don't wait to be invited. They only need to know where warmth remains. Then they come, like hungry beasts in the heart of winter. The sky had not yet lightened. No rooster crowed, no wind stirred, only a thick, heavy silence, the kind that falls in a crowded room when suddenly everyone goes still, and every eye turns towards something that has just appeared or just vanished forever. Jonas woke without knowing why. He sat upright in the stiff chair beside the window, his back aching, neck stiff from a dreamless night. The house was still dark, but outside, something had changed. No sound, but he could see it, feel it. He rose and walked slowly to the front door. He didn't open it right away. He rested a hand on the grip of his gun, drew the Colt from its old leather holster hanging on the wall. Then he opened the door. No one out there, just damp ground from dew. The wild grass before the porch had been trampled, and across the dry earth, right on the wooden step, a single red streak as if someone had dragged a finger through blood. Long, dead center, trembling, but deliberate. The mark of the traffickers. Jonas dropped to one knee. He didn't touch the blood, just stared at it, long enough for dew to settle in his hair. The blood was still wet, not animal. The smell was rich, sharp, metallic, human. No need for more, just that. A message, a final warning. Hand her over or die. Jonas stood, didn't lock the door, but closed it with both hands, as if pressing everything back inside, refusing to let the house betray what had shifted. He walked to the horse pen. The sky had not yet turned gray. His black horse lifted its head, snorted once, then stood still, as if it too sensed something wrong. Jonas didn't rush. He brushed the horse's coat, adjusted the bridle, set the saddle neatly on the fence rail. Then he took a cloth and began wiping down the Winchester. Slowly, like a man folding away a part of his life he wasn't ready to reread. No curse, no complaint, only silence. The sun began to rise, but weak, as if even it hesitated to show itself, where blood had been left behind. Jonas returned to the cabin. In his hands, a rolled oilcloth. Inside were a revolver, a knife, a few rounds, and a canteen. He placed it on the table. Nia had been awake for some time. She sat upright in bed, blanket fallen to her waist. The dim light cast across her face. The bruise on her cheek had softened, her eyes still deep, but no longer clouded. She didn't ask, didn't scream. She just said 3 words. "I fight too." Jonas stood still. That sentence, simple, firm, needed no translation. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He simply pulled another small knife from the cupboard and laid it beside her share. She looked, didn't touch it yet, but her eyes, they were the eyes of someone who had decided not to die in silence. Last night, a stranger left a mark. This morning, those who remained chose how they would live, not by running, but by staying. And in the West, That's when the real story begins. Morning light filtered through the gaps in the wood, casting long streaks across the dusty floor. No wind, no birdsong. The house still stood, old, silent, but the air inside had shifted, like still water after a heavy stone drops in. No ripples to see, but everyone knows something deep has been stirred. Jonas packed, not much, only what mattered: ammunition, water, rope, a weathered map with torn edges, and a small leather pouch of medicine left by Towseen. Nia stood behind him in silence, wearing an old oversized shirt of his. Her face had regained some color. Her gaze was direct. No more fear, only focus, the hard edge of someone who knew. The enemy was no longer behind her, but waiting ahead. Jonas led out the horse. The tall black gelding, muscle-hard like carved stone, inhaled a deep breath of desert wind, then stood still, like a marker placed at the edge of consequence. Jonas saddled it, strapped the bag, slid a rifle across his back. Each motion precise, like he'd done it every day of his life, though truthfully it had been nearly 10 years since he'd stepped beyond the ranch line. Nia wanted to ride. Jonas said nothing. He simply turned to her and held out a hand. A small gesture, no explanation needed, and she understood. She would come, not as someone clinging to the back, weeping, but as someone walking beside him like a wild thing that had broken its trap and turned to bite the hunter. Towseen was already waiting at the base of the ridge. His horse, a red-brown stallion, matched Jonas's in size. A bow and quiver sat across Towseen's shoulder, not for threat, but for symbol. The silent weapon of those who didn't waste sound when death could arrive as quickly as a blink. No greetings, no rituals. 3 riders, 3 horses, 1 aim. They rode south, toward the place Towseen had named, a canyon where Crover had set camp, a trading post between desert and damnation. Along the trail they saw a tattered shirt flapping in the brush, like skin shed and left behind. A mule abandoned, its mouth sewn shut with iron wire, eyes rolled back white. And after a bend, a dead man. Hands tied, thumb cut off, a black square mark scrawled on his forehead in charcoal. Crover didn't advertise. He left signs, and his signs were bodies. By noon, they reached the edge of a cliff. Below, the canyon yawned open like the mouth of some sleeping beast. Inside, 5 cage wagons, canvas-draped, arranged in a circle. Each held 3 to 8 people, women, children, mostly dark-skinned, a few in soiled white dresses. They looked like merchandise. Nearby, a makeshift wood shack, 2 armed guards, a rough table, and Crover Black, long hair, leopard skin coat, a face full of scars, smiling like a whiskey peddler at a church fair. He didn't look up, but he likely knew someone had followed the trail. Jonas viewed him through binoculars, didn't tremble, didn't bite his lip. He watched like a man checking inventory, cold, exact, and unwilling to let feeling interfere. Towseen whispered, "We wait for night." But Jonas shook his head. He set the binoculars down, drew his gun from its holster, and said in a voice dry and deep, "I'm not here to bargain." Then he rode forward, didn't look back, didn't ask for help, didn't wonder who would live or die. Because for men like him, those who lived beyond the edges of history, doing the right thing never needed an audience and never waited for thanks. His name was Crover Black, and this time, he wasn't leaving that canyon. Jonas's horse descended the slope like a slow-moving stone loosened from the mountain. Each hoof struck the hardened ground with a deep, steady rhythm, not rushed, as if the horse too understood that what was about to happen could not be undone. Towseen said nothing, but he didn't stay behind. He guided his horse along the ridge, quiet as an arrow still drawn, not yet loosed. Nia walked. Her steps were firm, a small knife in her hand, not for fighting but for cutting chains when the moment came. Below, Crover Black was smiling. He leaned against a tent pole, a dark drink in hand. A guard whispered something to him, pointing toward Jonas, but Crover didn't move. He only curled one corner of his mouth, the smile of a man who believes everything has already gone according to plan. Jonas stopped his horse 40 paces from the camp. No cover, no disguise. He dismounted, slowly, like a man stepping down to bury someone he once knew. Right hand held the gun, left hung loose. Wind picked up. Not strong, but enough to carry the scent of rusted iron from the cage wagons up to him. A woman cried from inside one. A small girl lay in her arms, head drooping like a broken stem. Jonas walked forward, each step heavy, as if treading on gravestones. Solid, unflinching, without pause. Crover lifted his glass. "Old man, what's this? Come to save the world." Jonas said nothing. Crover sneered, eyes narrowing. "Heard you used to be border patrol. Now just a wrinkled ranch keeper. You really think you can—" The gunshot cut him off. Jonas fired first. No warning, no count. The first bullet struck the man beside Crover in the chest. The second hit another mid-draw, dead center through the temple. Then chaos. Tauzin released arrows from the ridge like rain, each one followed by a body falling. Crover's men reacted too slow, failing to place where death was coming from. Jonas crossed the camp yard. Bullets tore the air near his ears. He didn't stop. His hand didn't shake. Each shot he fired ended a man who thought he'd see tomorrow. Crover ran, slipping into an empty cage wagon, firing blindly over his shoulder. One bullet grazed Jonas's shoulder, but he kept moving. Slow, steady, like a man carving headstones with his stride. Nia appeared behind them, unnoticed. She cut the lock on one wagon. Women and children spilled out, barefoot, bruised, eyes blank from too long in the dark. Crover shouted, dragging a little girl from a nearby cage, pressing a gun to her head. back off, or I'll—" The gunshot rang out, sharp, dry, final. Crover collapsed, one bullet, dead center in the chest. From Jonas's hand. No words, no last chances, no justifications. Crover fell like all men who believed evil was a form of power and ended as all sin must end, simply, quietly, and without a mourner. Flames began to rise from the tents. Someone had lit the canvas to break the locks. Smoke twisted skyward, carrying with it the stench of burnt hair, seared skin, and the long exhale of those who had just stepped out of the shadows. Jonas stood in the yard, unmoving, blood on his hands, dust in his eyes, smoke in his lungs, but alive. Tauzin approached, placed a hand on his shoulder softly, a thank you too old to be spoken aloud. Nia ran to him. She didn't cry, but her eyes were wet. The fire burned. But this time, it wasn't a nightmare. It was a cleansing flame. And for those who'd once been locked in like cargo, it brought light again. Dawn stretched like a final breath. Across the red earth, still stained with the scent of blood and smoke, the desert wind slipped through the canyon like trembling strings of a distant fiddle. No songs, no cheers. The survivors only stood, still, not yet believing their feet had stepped beyond the cage, or that their chests were no longer crushed by ropes or the laughter of a man in a wide-brimmed hat whose hands always smelled of bootleg whiskey. Nia walked among them. No one told her to, but each glance, each quiet touch on her shoulder said they understood. She wasn't just a victim who had escaped. She was the one who had begun it all. Jonas stood a few paces away, leaning against a cactus tree. He watched the crowd, not to count the living, but to see if anyone was still missing anyone. Arms wrapped around each other. Children crawled to their mothers' feet. Men who had been bound dropped to their knees in prayer, not in words but in broken sobs, as if stones long buried inside them were finally being lifted away. There were no bugles, no flags, only sunlight beginning to rest on the shoulders of those who had just been given their names back. Nia stepped toward Jonas. She didn't speak. She just looked at him for a long time, like someone trying to remember the face of a father or of the one person who had protected her when no one else had looked her way. Then she embraced him, not tightly, not long, but just enough for Jonas to feel her slender shoulders trembling, not from fear, but from the weight she could finally lay down. He didn't return the hug right away. At first, his hand hovered awkwardly, unsure, but then it rested gently on her back, a firm pat, steady, unhurried, and his eyes turned toward the desert, not avoiding but as if telling himself quietly, "I kept my word." A few people approached. A woman offered him a bundle of dried grass tied with red string, an Apache token for an outsider who had saved their people. A man placed a hand over his heart and bowed his head. A child came forward offering him an empty shell casing, the only gift he had, but also the proof he had survived. Jonas didn't say thank you, and they didn't wait for him to. Among those who had lost even their names, silence was the highest form of respect. The sun climbed higher. It shone down on the cage wagons, now empty. It lit the body of Crover, wrapped in torn canvas, left at the edge of camp like a wild animal that had died alone. No one glanced his way. The light reached Jonas's face too, and for the first time in a very long time, he let it stay there. In the West, not all who survive are called heroes, but there are some who, simply by refusing to turn their backs, become part of the land that will never be forgotten. 1 week later, the old cabin still stood, silent, weathered as if no standoff had ever happened. No blood had ever been drawn across its door. No riders had come from the desert. The wind still passed through the missing shingles. The windows still leaned crooked. The broken porch post still lay there, like a bleached bone left to dry. Jonas returned with the black horse. He dismounted without a sound, letting the reins slip free like a hand just released from a long nightmare. The cabin door wasn't locked, but no one had come. The stable hadn't changed, except for a little more dust. He wasn't searching for anything, didn't expect anyone to be waiting. But when he stepped onto the old wooden porch, he stopped. On the wooden peg outside, where he used to hang his hat, there now hung a leather bracelet, small, delicate, braided from strands of hair cord and pieces of dark-dyed hide. At its center, a wooden bead carved in haste with a knife, crude, rough, but clear enough to show one letter. J beneath it, a small scrap of paper, handwritten in broken English. "You made one life matter, I'll never forget." Jonas didn't smile, didn't cry. He simply took the bracelet in his hand, lightly, as if it might dissolve in the sunlight. His fingers were rough, scarred with age and history, but as he held the bracelet, he held it like something too fragile, too precious to be rushed. He stepped inside. Beside the oil lamp still sat the photo of his wife. Jonas lowered himself into the old chair, the bracelet still in hand, placing it over his chest like someone holding on to the last warmth after a long, cold night. No voices rose, no desert cries called his name, only the afternoon light slipping through the cracks in the door and the wind curling through the porch. A familiar sound, like someone whispering from very far away. "You didn't save the whole world, but you saved one person, and maybe that's enough." The late wind carried the scent of cactus and hot sand, brushing across the western slope like a tired hand, gently smoothing a land once scorched. The sun, blood-red and low on the horizon, left a long streak of light like a vein drained from stone. The sky opened into a quiet hue of violet and gold, not triumphant, not sorrowful, just deep like the memory of old souls. Jonas sat on the porch. The old wooden chair still creaked each time he shifted. as if it remembered he had left it for nearly 10 days, something he hadn't done since his wife passed. He didn't return with trophies, didn't keep the gun, didn't speak of what he'd done, only the bracelet, still resting in his palm, like a whisper that wouldn't fade. The field ahead hadn't changed. Patches of yellowed grass, clusters of cactus like stone teeth anchored in the dirt. Farther off, low ridgelines lay like the back of an old horse, sleeping under wind and dust. No one came, and no one needed to. In a place like this, memory doesn't need to be shared, only lived alongside, quietly and faithfully, like the way one learns to live with a scar, not flaunting it, but never forgetting. On the table, a cup of cold tea. By his boot, the same pair he'd worn on the last walk into blood and fire, now dusty but not stained, as if that battle, real as it was, had been only one small chapter in all that made him. He looked off into the distance, not at anything specific, maybe the horizon, maybe the old well, maybe the place where he first saw a brown speck in the dust he mistook for an animal and found instead a human being running from evil with only her final look left to give. No one told that story, no newspapers, no documents, no grave with his name carved in stone. But somewhere far from here, perhaps in a small house near the border or beneath a tree in an Apache village, a woman would tell her children, "There was a time when someone who didn't know my name, who asked for no thanks, stepped out of the dark just to keep me alive." And if a child were to ask, who was he? Maybe the only answer would be, just a man who didn't turn away when everyone else had reason to. On the porch beam, the leather bracelet stirred in the wind. It tapped gently against the wood, thump, thump, steady like the heartbeat of an old man who had weathered every storm. Jonas didn't sleep, but he closed his eyes, and the wind passed over his lids like someone walking through his life once more. No one would write that story in a history book, but those who survived, they don't forget. Because sometimes one person choosing to stand is enough for a whole world to keep walking. There are stories that don't need to end with gunfire or a hurried kiss. There are lives that only need to be remembered by someone, and that alone keeps them from being lost to dust. Jonas Thorne didn't become a hero. He didn't change the world, but he saved one soul, with hands that once only held the past. And maybe, in a place as dry as the West, as unforgiving as life, that's still the most beautiful thing we can do for one another. If you've ever known the feeling of loss, if you've ever loved something that's gone or kept a promise no one else remembered, leave a note in the comments. You don't need to say much. A single dot is enough to let us know you were here and that this story found you. The West was never meant for the weak, but some people, they weren't strong either. They simply lived kindly to the very end.